It was an ordinary night in a small town in the countryside, the kind of place where everyone knows each other and the streets become deserted after nightfall. Lara, a 27-year-old woman, decided to move into a small and cozy apartment, seeking a fresh start after a failed relationship. The building was old, with colonial architecture, thick walls, and solid wooden doors that creaked at the slightest movement. Despite the air of decay the building carried, it had a charm that immediately attracted Lara. The apartment she moved into was on the second floor, at the end of a long and narrow corridor, illuminated by dim lamps that flickered the moment she first entered. On the very first night, Lara noticed something peculiar, a constant noise that seemed to come from the adjacent apartment. It was a low but disturbing sound, as if someone were dragging furniture across the floor, but always at night, and always the same way, as if it were a ritual. Lara tried to ignore the sounds, attributing them to an elderly neighbor or someone who perhaps had insomnia. But as the days passed, the noise continued, growing more intense, and always at the same time. Exactly at 3 in the morning. Curious, Lara began to ask the other residents about who lived next door. The answer was always the same. The apartment had been empty for years. The last tenant had been a lady who, according to the neighbors, was extremely reserved and rarely left her home. Intrigued, Lara decided to investigate on her own. She started paying more attention to the details, and it was then that she noticed something even stranger. The sound seemed to move. It didn't come from a single point in the neighboring apartment, but seemed to shift as if something or someone was slowly walking back and forth. One night, driven by a mix of curiosity and fear, Lara decided to stay awake until the time of the strange noises. When the clock struck 3 in the morning, the sound began again, this time louder and clearer than ever. Lara felt a shiver run down her spine when she realized that the noise was now coming from outside her own door, in the corridor. With her heart racing, she slowly approached the door, not quite knowing what she expected to find on the other side. She pressed her ear against the wood and in doing so, clearly heard heavy, almost labored breathing, as if someone were standing right there, waiting for her. Lara recoiled sharply, her body trembling with fear. She stepped back from the door and grabbed her cell phone, intending to call the police, but the words of one of the neighbors echoed in her mind. "No one lives next door, dear. That apartment has been empty since the old lady died." That night, Lara couldn't sleep. The sound persisted, relentless, until dawn, when it finally ceased, leaving her exhausted and terrified. Determined to find a rational explanation, she spent the next day trying to locate the building's owner to learn more about the history of the adjacent apartment. After much effort, she got in touch with the former caretaker, an elderly man who had worked in the building for decades. When Lara mentioned the apartment next to hers, the caretaker fell silent for a long moment before finally speaking in a grave tone. "The lady who lived there was very lonely. They say she died in her bed, and her body was only found days later. Since then, no one wanted to live in that place." Despite the ominous warning, Lara couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. She returned to her apartment, determined to uncover the truth. That night, at 3 in the morning, the sounds began again, but this time Lara was ready. With a courage she didn't know she possessed, she opened the door and stepped into the corridor. What she found there was something she could never have imagined. At the end of the corridor, where the neighboring apartment should have been, there was only a dark door, locked, and a deadly silence. But as soon as she approached, the door began to creak, slowly opening. Inside, the apartment was as it had been left years ago, with furniture covered by white sheets and a thick layer of dust covering everything. In the center of the room was an old rocking chair, gently moving, as if someone had just gotten up from it. Lara took a step back, but before she could leave, the door slammed shut behind her. The air became dense and cold, and then she felt it. A presence, something that was there with her. She looked around, trying to identify where the sensation was coming from, but there was no one. Still, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Suddenly, a shadow passed by the corner of her eye. Quick and almost imperceptible, but enough to make her scream. The sound reverberated through the empty apartment, but no one answered. The rocking chair stopped, and the silence became unbearable. Lara tried to open the door, but it was locked. Desperate, she began to pound on the wood, calling for help, but her hands went right through, as if the door were made of mist. It was then that she heard a low, hoarse laugh coming from somewhere behind her. When she turned around, the vision that met her made her blood run cold. In the dark corner of the room, an indistinct figure like a shadow began to move toward her, slow and relentless. Its eyes were empty but fixed on Lara, as if it were studying her, and then she knew. That presence was not just a memory. It was not a simple haunting. It was something that was trapped there, something that wanted to get out, and it had chosen Lara. With all the strength she had left, Lara backed away to the door, and in a last effort, she finally gave way. Running down the corridor without looking back, she returned to her apartment, locking the door behind her, breathing heavily and her heart pounding uncontrollably. 4 days. Lara avoided leaving her apartment at night. The sounds did not cease, but she learned to ignore them, or at least tried. Each night was a battle, but she was determined not to be consumed by fear. Until one night, silence prevailed. Lara thought she was finally free, that the nightmare was over. However, as she lay down, she heard a familiar sound coming from the corridor. It was the sound of footsteps, but this time they stopped right in front of her door. Without daring to move, Lara remained paralyzed in bed, praying that all of it was just a dream. But when she heard the slight creak of the doorknob, she knew she was far from waking up. The real nightmare was just beginning. That night, Lara barely managed to sleep. The experience had left deep scars in her mind, and with every sound or movement she heard in the apartment, she felt on the verge of collapse. The day dawned, but relief did not come. The air was heavy, as if the presence of what she had encountered in the apartment next door was surrounding her. Even in the daylight, Lara began to notice small changes in her surroundings. Objects were displaced, shadows seemed to dance on the walls as night fell, and a cold that seemed to intensify, despite the summer heat outside. It was as if something was permeating her reality, something she couldn't see but could feel. The next night, she decided she couldn't stay in that place any longer. She hurriedly packed her bags, determined to leave the apartment before something worse happened. But when she tried to open the door to leave, it wouldn't move. The key turned in the lock, but the door wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was keeping her trapped there. Desperate, Lara began pounding on the door, screaming for help. Her knocks echoed down the empty corridor, but no one answered. The clock struck 3 in the morning when she finally gave up trying to open the door. Panting, she leaned against the wall, trying to control the rising panic. Then the sound started again. The same noise of furniture being dragged, but this time, it seemed to come from inside her own apartment. Lara looked around, her heart racing, and saw that the mirror on the hallway wall was fogged up, as if someone had breathed against it. As she approached, she saw words forming on the glass, as if written by an invisible hand. "You belong to me." Lara stepped back, feeling a chill run down her spine. Her mind was panicked, but something inside her knew it was useless to try to escape. Whatever was chasing her was there, with her, and wouldn't let her go so easily. The mirror began to crack, fine lines spreading like spider webs, until it shattered into thousands of pieces. Lara covered herself, protecting her face. But when she looked again, she saw something that made her scream. Reflected in the shards of the broken mirror was the image of the old lady who had once lived in the apartment next door. Her eyes were empty, and her mouth was open in a silent scream. Not knowing what to do, Lara ran to the bedroom, where she locked herself in, holding her breath, hoping that all of it would pass. But in the silence of the night, she heard dragging footsteps down the hallway. They were getting closer until they stopped right outside the door. Lara knew she wasn't alone, that the presence terrifying her was there, just on the other side. With trembling hands, she grabbed her phone and tried to call someone, but the line was dead. No sound, no voice, just emptiness. And then the door began to open. Slowly, the hinges creaking as a shadowy figure formed in the darkness. Lara tried to scream, but her voice wouldn't come out. She was paralyzed, completely consumed by fear. The figure entered the room, moving slowly, as if savoring every moment. It was the old lady, but deformed, her skin pale and withered, her eyes dead and her mouth twisted into a macabre smile. Lara backed up to the bed, her back pressed against the wall, with nowhere to run. You need to leave," Lara finally managed to say, her voice weak and trembling. But the figure only moved closer, extending a skeletal hand toward her. "I've been waiting for you," the voice whispered, echoing through the room. Lara closed her eyes, expecting the worst, but instead of feeling the cold touch, she heard a different sound. A long, suffering sigh, like the last breath of someone about to die. When she opened her eyes again, the figure had disappeared, leaving only emptiness and silence. Slowly, the air seemed to return to normal, and the door that wouldn't open before was now ajar. Scared, but with no other option, Lara stood up, grabbed her things and rushed out, leaving everything behind. She ran down the stairs and out of the building without looking back, her entire body trembling with terror. But what Lara didn't notice as she ran down the deserted street was that the sound of the footsteps following her weren't just echoes of her own fear. The presence that had tormented her in the apartment was still with her, invisible but not absent. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, nor the cold that seemed to follow her wherever she went. Days later, Lara found a new place to live, far from that neighborhood. But the nightmare was far from over. On her first night in the new apartment, while trying to convince herself she was safe, the clock struck 3 in the morning, and in the silence of the night, a familiar sound echoed through the hallway. It was the sound of footsteps, dragging and slow, coming closer and closer. Lara, petrified with fear, knew that no matter how much she tried to run, what had started in the old building would follow her forever. The scream she had been holding in her throat finally escaped when she saw the doorknob turn, revealing once more the figure of the old lady. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her, a legion of shadows emerged, each more terrifying than the last. Lara realized, with a desperation that paralyzed her completely, that there was nowhere to run. She had been marked, and now the nightmare would consume her wherever she was. In the end, the door opened completely, and the shadows lunged at Lara. Her scream echoed through the building, but no one heard. From that moment on, Lara ceased to exist to the outside world. And the next morning, the apartment was empty, as if she had never been there. All that remained was the distant echo of a voice, whispering from beyond, "You belong to me forever."